The window is a small storefront display which happens to be in the heart of the gay village at 558 Church Street in Toronto. The benefit is that this display is visible 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. When presented with the opportunity of showing my work in the window, I saw this as a chance to make a statement about homophobia and senseless violence against the LGBTQ community. The pieces in this display are examples of gun violence, stabbings, and gay bashing. In 2016, we witnessed the devastating massacre of 49 persons in the Orlando nightclub shooting. In 2022, there was another shooting in Oslo on the eve of Pride. In March 1989, Joe Rose was stabbed and bled to death. He was targeted for his pink hair. In this video, we discuss the circumstances and consequences between two fatal gay bashing events. Kenneth Zeller was killed in 1985 in Toronto, Canada. Daniel Zamudio was killed in 2012 in Santiago, Chile. His death precipitated the introduction of anti-discrimination laws in Chile, which are still in place today. So as you can see, there's some images right here, and they're very abstract. It is photography. Some of you know how I do this, and I will explain it in a short second. But as I was saying, for instance, terrorism. This first image here, for instance, is the Madrid train station attack many years ago, and that was a case of international terrorism. This next one over is actually Buenos Aires. And it's meant to document and commemorate the victims of the state dictatorship there that ran for several years. There were like, I think there were 30,000 names of they're in English, the disappeared ones, but they basically erased the identities. The next one over is a much older one I did many years ago. It's Munich. And that was a case of domestic terrorism, a case of somebody, it was the Oktoberfest bombing. It happened in September. I think the perpetrator actually died in that as well, but it was a far right-wing radicalized person that wanted to make some sort of statement. This is the thing, a lot of these are making some sort of statement or not, and it just ends in death, and there is no advancement in this ideology. There's no purpose behind it. So this bottom left one here is Las Vegas, and I don't know if any of you remember the Vegas shooting. I can't remember the exact year, but it was outside the Mandalay Bay Hotel, and it was the biggest shooting for the longest while. This middle one here, the blue on the bottom, that is from the Montreal Massacre. And that was in 1989. That one I remember very clearly, and we're coming up to that date as well. That'll be December 6th, and I do believe it's 34 years. And then this bottom far right was the Orlando one, which was the shooting in the gay nightclub, and that took 49 lives. So you can see I've got just about every topic covered there. But what is the main objective of this series? Well, the first thing is to document without using any triggering images. I mean, we've all seen pictures that, you know, in the news that have included things that you don't necessarily want to see. It can be very triggering. So what I tend to do is I will tend to choose something that's somewhat site-specific, and it could be something where healing occurs. So it could be things such as hospitals, courthouses, museums, places of worship, art galleries, memorials. This first one here was Spain, Madrid. That's an actual memorial in the train station. I had a hard time finding it at first. It's a special vacuum sealed room because part of it is inflated up over the top system. the top floor of it. The one in the middle is the Santiago, and that was actually the courthouse. And I will get to that story in a second. And then the one on the far right is actually a different aspect of the facade of the Orlando Health Medical Center. And you'll wonder what kind of building would have such a strong pink in it. It doesn't. What I'll do is sometimes I will super saturate the colors. I don't change colors, but I will super saturate them. Sometimes when the colors overlap, like let's say a blue and a yellow overlap, it might create a green. The second objective of this is actually to commemorate, the lives that are taken and those that are dealing, the survivors. It's the survivors and the families that have to continue living with this situation. So there is a certain amount of collective trauma with this and collective memory. And then finally, and I really was, I always had this idea, but when I was in Oslo, it was really hammered into me the importance of education. Like I like this art to invoke a discussion, and especially with younger people, in order to combat any radicalization, any delusional thinking. The reason why I mentioned this with Oslo, I was looking for the location. I thought it was a memorial. It turned out to be a museum. And actually, it was a very interesting museum. They're actually building an official one now. It was very child friendly. There was nothing really disturbing in there, not on the surface per se. And they were using it as an education center as well. So they were inviting teachers, students. They were writing curriculum for this because this was the Oslo shooting in 2011, July 22nd. And that's the name of the museum, July 22nd. And that's when a case of domestic terrorism, a young man that was radicalized went on a shooting spree. First, he set off a bomb close to the government buildings, and then he drove out to that Utoya Island and just went on a shooting spree. So I do believe the Norwegians are trying very hard never to have an event like that again. He was caught alive. He was tried. He has no remorse. So this brings me now to Never Surrender. This is almost like a subset. When I had my Vancouver show, because there were so many pieces in there, I started grouping things in triptychs and diptychs, and it was working. So, I had 3 pieces together that were actually about international terrorism, and it was the Paris 02, so the Paris attacks, I think of 2015. There was the Montreal massacre, and then the Oslo one. And so I could talk about a discussion with that. And the common element with all of those 3 was that each one of those places, or each of those locations, was creating some sort of institution or had something in place to start fighting that. So I just mentioned what Oslo had. If you're familiar at all with the Montreal attacks, you know that there is a group called Police se souvient, and they are basically, I think, led by the survivors and mothers of those attacks, and they are fighting, for better gun control in Canada. And the Paris attacks, they are actually going to be building a big museum to commemorate and educate as well. So this seems to be the thing to do. The reason why it's called Never Surrender, one of the stories in this collection, the one that happened in Toronto, Kenneth Zeller, that happened in 1985. And then I just happened to Google what was the #1 hit song that year. And when I saw this and it popped up, and of course I had the earworm in my head, because the song so well. But then I looked at the lyrics and it really seemed to fit as well. I was quite surprised. So I kind of just hijacked that title for my purposes at the moment. There's no real connection per se, but it just worked in nicely there. So these are the different pieces, and now I'm going to explain how I actually do this. So I start with a rectangular image, as you see here on the right-hand side, And I will make copies. I'll flip it back to front and then wrap it into a circle. And then often I'll take multiple copies of that circle. I'll rotate it a bit and superimpose it. Rotate it a bit and superimpose it. So that's how you end up getting these sort of kaleidoscopic images here that, you know, you can't really see. I should have included a close-up, but you would be able to see. You see these palm fringes here? Well, they are visible down here and here. So these are usually printed, like the two prints here behind me, at around 40 by 40 inches, which is about 100 centimeters, in case you are in another country that uses metric. Canada is supposed to be metric, but we still use inches. So this is the facade of the Orlando Regional Medical Center, which was just blocks away from the Pulse nightclub. So we went down there. It was my husband's business medical trip. And we went to the location. You just cannot believe that feeling of feeling so conspicuous, that something like this could happen. And, for the lack of timing or whatever, I wasn't there. But to think that, those people were shot and then there was a lockdown and this hospital is just blocks away. This is a different entrance from the same thing. I created this piece much later than the other one. The other one has been out in circulation and there's a few copies of the 40 by 40s out there. This one here, you can see ever so faintly on the right-hand side where the silver is, there's a bit of a pink. I just really pulled that out. The courthouse, I actually only used this top part. This was Oslo. But to create this with the windows and everything, it can be difficult sometimes. Oslo hasn't been fully resolved yet. I don't know what's fully going on with that. It was very hard to find information. I could only find out the names of the two victims. But if you've ever been to any of these Scandinavian countries, these cities are actually rather small. And this courthouse is right adjacent, like it's a square. And this courthouse faces into the square, and the pub, the London pub, also faces into the square, because there was no picture I could get from the pub. And I don't usually like to do the crime scenes, but I thought the courthouse would be a little bit more appropriate. So it's not the first time I've done something with a courthouse. This happened in the summer of 2022. We were there in the fall of 2022. I'd forgotten how fresh that incident was. And then this piece, Montreal, and the Santiago piece happened almost around the same time. This piece was difficult to do at first. We were in Montreal for another medical conference. And what do you find? The story, a lot of these stories, especially with these, the individuals, like when it's just an individual person and there's not necessarily any sort of memorial. I chose here just a part of the detail of the subway station. And why specifically that subway station? Well, the incident happened close to there, but more importantly, there is a plan to put a memorial plaque in the plaza and behind the station. It's not an incredibly pretty building, but when I saw these curves on this kind of, I'm not quite sure what function these have on the building, I knew that this would work. And so in this case, when I'm doing, and this is multiple rotations, I also increased the size a bit each time, and you can see how it almost like spirals in. It really worked out well. I was rather pleased. But there was this one, and I'm going to get to the story in a second, and it was difficult at first, but with this piece, what I did was I cheated. I cheated in that I introduced a curve, because the straight lines as a whole don't always work. But if you look at the piece, you can see the curve, and these are actually just basically two circles superimposed, but the way it worked was perfect. It almost looked like a glass marble. And I said, that's it. That's the piece right away. But if you look along here in the bottom, you can see even those parts. I'm not sure what you would call those rivets. I know we have somebody in the audience that would know the technical architectural term for that, but that's okay. And then this was the Toronto piece. Since I knew I had the Montreal piece and I had the Santiago piece, I said, there has to be a Toronto story. So we will get to that shortly, but you can see here that this is a relief sculpture on the side of what used to be the Toronto Board of Education, which is now on College Street and is part of U of T Medical School. And here you will be able to see much more. You can see that detail. So here's a case where I also flipped it on the inside as well as on the outside. So this all together became my little display. It's a very small window. It's, you know, on Church Street, but it was the perfect location and the perfect opportunity to almost run this sort of experiment. And I really like this idea on how I can make this collection a grouping. And I think I might pursue then things in different groupings like this. So we start then with the trip. This was our trip to Santiago. And I kind of, it gets really bad now. You know, my husband always plans these trips. And the next thing I'm doing is Googling, you know, the city's name, terrorism, the city's name, shooting, the city's name. I'm looking for something to photograph to include in my series. I do take pictures of other things. It was a beautiful trip in Chile, by the way, Juan. We went up to the Atacama Desert. You know, I've got a lot of great pictures there. And, you know, we did see a lot of the rest of Santiago. So this was on the map. I sort of Googled it. We came to it. I didn't quite know what to make of it at first, but then I quickly figured it out, because when you see things that are like a memorial, then you begin to figure it out. So there's some graffiti here and everything, but you can see here on a wall, here is a drawing of this young man, Daniel Zamudio. And there's some other things here. Here, you can see the memorial. So you obviously understand this is where he actually, it's a horrible, horrible story. And I'm not going to go into the details, but it was very brutal. It was unbelievably brutal and barbaric. I did read a book. I haven't finished it yet. I am learning Spanish. And that first chapter gave so many details. I'm glad I didn't understand every word. But I knew I couldn't get the picture here. So I went, then we walked over, and this was again just blocks away. This was the hospital where he was taken. And this is where I think he was in a coma for several weeks before he finally passed. And it was sort of horrible, yes. And then we came to the courthouse. And this was a magnificent building here. It's a bit more on the north end of the city, right? And it's quite impressive. You know, this is a distorted view. The two parts on the right and the left, they actually connect. And it's kind of like a bridge over the top there, but it was a very impressive building. And it's almost too much for me to use. But then when I came across the windows and I said, okay, I know blue works. I know I can do something with this as well. So this is why I selected this here. But this, I'm gonna hop now to the Toronto story, which actually kind of surprised and upset me. This is actually from an archive file. This was the actual story in Toronto Life. It's 8 pages, makes for an interesting read. This happened in 1985. I mean, I was down here in 1985 already. I was going to university in Hamilton, often going back and forth. I knew virtually nothing about this story. Well, nothing. I found out about it just recently. But this was, I think he's, yes, 40 years old. He was a teacher librarian. He was in, it was the last day of school. He was in Hyde Park. There is no, just trying to word this very carefully because it came up during the trial. And this is the thing that I really resent a bit. It was almost portrayed like, why was he in the park at night, by himself? So there's right away this I think the word is aspersion, cast upon him. But I mean, that same argument could be turned around and say, why were those 5 boys in the park that night? They were looking as well to do trouble. And this is the area. I don't know if anybody, people from the Toronto area, but this was, it was in the southern part of High Park, close to this Colborne Lodge. And again, it's a park situation. It was 5 young boys 17, 18. I mean, overnight, you're suddenly an adult. And they brutalized him. And when finally he was found, I mean, it was only actually after an hour or so, he was brought to St. Joseph Medical Center, and he was pronounced dead on arrival. He died almost instantly from those injuries. And that brings me to this. I knew he was a teacher, but where was the board office at that time? This was prior to the amalgamation. And originally I thought it was the board office that was sort of in the north part of the city, but some friends of mine helped me figure this out. And I had passed this building so many times, going back and forth across the city. And I had seen this relief sculpture on the side here so many times, and I had never put it together. And this used to be the old board office. And this is here, a typical figure in front of the lamp of learning. It's very much an education symbol. And this also hit home because, this is a teacher, right? I mean, I taught for 30 years, so it just seemed too real, this situation. So these are the 2 things. I mean, the similarities between these 2 cases are sort of interesting. A bunch of young men that for some reason feel it's necessary to beat somebody. The consequence is death. Parks, isolated, and both of them had a major change. So effect on the society. Well, not the Toronto one so much, but definitely the Santiago one. But so before I ask Juan specific questions about that, I just thought maybe you'd like to introduce yourself, Juan, and also tell what you're doing at the moment, with, I'm going to stop this for a moment now so that we can see you. How do I do this? Whoops, I went too far. Hold on, there we go. Okay. So if you could introduce yourself, Juan, and explain what you're doing. I know you belong to a group also called Iguales. Okay.
Yes, well, thank you, Thomas, for inviting me. First of all, I want to apologize for my English. I don't usually speak English, though I do speak English, but I don't usually do it. So if I make any mistake, please feel free to correct me because I might make some mistakes. I'm Juan Enrique Pi. I'm a Chilean lawyer and a human rights activist. Today, well, I'm part of Fundación Iguales. Fundación Iguales is an NGO that fights for LGBT rights. We have been involved in the last 5 laws that Chile approved in the last 10 years since Daniel died, actually, since Daniel was killed, actually. That are the anti-discrimination law, the civil union, the gender identity law, and the marriage equality last year. And nowadays I'm working in the National Rights Human Institution, in the Human Rights National Institution, and I'm in Valparaiso, as Thomas told you, because we're processing our budget bill. So I had to be here. I had to be in the Congress that is in Valparaiso tomorrow really early. So I just got to the city. That's why I'm in a hotel room.
Well, that's wonderful. And I don't think you can really worry about your English. I think you speak better than some people. And I'm not casting any judgment on people in Toronto, but I mean, we're very used to people speaking at different levels with different levels of English, and you're doing just fine here.
Thank you.
No problem at all. So that's wonderful. So my first question to you is, did I get a lot of the details right or not? Or what did I miss out? Because when you do this research, it's very piecemeal and you never quite know whether or not to trust the internet. So, you know, things, and I did find out, it was interesting when I did the research on the Kenneth Zeller, I did get, you know, a short version, but finding that article in Toronto Life filled in a lot of the gaps. So did I get that sort of right, that story?
It's you were right. You were absolutely right. The first photo you showed is the place where Daniel was found, because he not just was smashed up, but he was abandoned after that, and he stayed in that place for several hours before he was found. And when he was found, he was taken to the hospital. There's the Posta Central de Santiago. That is the second picture that you showed. And then the third picture is where the criminal courts are in Santiago, not here in Valparaiso, in Santiago. And it was a place where this gang, these 4 guys that beat him, were judged. There are 3 of them are still in jail. One of them got free after some years serving in prison. So 3 of them are still in jail.
Well, one has a life sentence, correct?
Exactly. One of them had a life sentence.
Now, does a life sentence mean the same thing it does? Well, what does it mean in Chile? Because here a life sentence, I don't know, sometimes it seems like it can be chopped down and you will eventually get out.
Here in Chile, you can also live before you die, if you want to say it that way. But at least it's 20 years, at least. Okay. And these people were judged, if I'm not wrong, in 2012. So not 2013. So there might be still 11 years or 10 years for one of them at least.
Yeah. It's a horrible story. I'm still going to finish that book. I just let that flash there. You saw that. It's called Solos. Is it Solos or Solo en la Noche?
Solos en la Noche, sí.
I was going to bring that book up. Well, there's a few things. Okay, so as a result of Daniel Zamudio's murder, because let's get it correct, I mean, even though he was in a coma for 20, I mean, the damage that was done to him, let me just put it to you this way. I think I did read this correctly. He was unrecognizable.
Absolutely. And he was being eaten by ants.
Okay, that wasn't in the book.
Yes.
But yeah, he was completely unrecognizable. And when you read the description, you will see why. So the level of brutality was just amazing. And we've been seeing that sometimes lately in the news as well. And that will be a topic I'd like to come back to, because it gets to that whole point of dehumanization. It seems like people are able to do these horrible things when they don't think the other person is a human. But what I'd like to know is that the law, what happened with the law? How did that change it? And you were instrumental in that, or part of that?
Well, Fundación Iguales was part of the processing of the anti-discrimination bill after Daniel was murdered. That bill was presented 7 years before before this happened, and when it happened, it caused a huge scandal in Chile. Even though in those years most people didn't support LGBT rights. And it's really impressive what happened in 2012, because after a few months before Daniel was killed, also Chile was condemned by the Inter-American Human Rights Court because of the case of Karen Atala. She is a lesbian mother, that she is a judge here in Chile, a criminal judge actually, and the judiciary, the Supreme Court, took her kids away and give them to the father because she was a lesbian. That happened in 2004. And in 2012, in February of 2012, Chile was condemned for that case. The first case in the Inter-American Human Rights Court about LGBT rights. And then in March, Daniel is killed. And until those two episodes that happened both in 2012, most people didn't support LGBT rights. They were against even civil unions. And it's incredible if you see the polls about public opinion in those years. And the next year, in 2013, those curves absolutely changed. And most people begin to approve and to support LGBT rights. And nowadays, in 2023, almost 12 years ago, we have levels of support in the citizenship that are above 80% in marriage, in civil unions, against discrimination, also for trans people. So yes, 2012 was definitely an amazing year, a really shocking year, also, of course, a horrible year, but it had an incredible effect in the Chilean society.
Yeah, that's a pretty incredible story. It seems like you were kind of very far behind. I got that from the story I read. There was there wasn't, that bill had been stalled in the process. And then when this event happened, it seemed to outrage the whole country. And then I don't know, I forget the president's name at that time, but he really gave the push for that, even though
Sebastián Piñera.
Yeah, I don't think it was necessarily for it, but I think everybody agreed that there needed to be some sort of protection, correct?
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's really a sad story because until 2012, in Chile was legal to discriminate, you know? When you say it and when you heard it in 2023 and say 11 years ago, discrimination was legal, you think, well, what happened in this country, right? But after that year, as I told you, that this bill was 7 years. It was presented in 2005 by President Ricardo Lagos, and in 2012 with President Piñera. After the first term of President Bachelet, it just took 6 or 8 months to become a law. Because the case of Daniel and also the case of Karen and the court and the Inter-American Human Rights Court.
Very, very interesting. That I didn't know. Now I did read somewhere, because you read scattered and you find stuff, but I mean, it's nothing I can really latch on to properly. But I did read somewhere there was a criticism that the law isn't, well, first of all, I think everybody needs to know the law is named after this young man, right? It's La Ley Zamudio. Some people don't feel it's strong enough. Is there any word on that? Or is it a case that the law is there, but the consequences aren't there?
Yes, I would say that when it comes to criminal cases, it works more than when it comes to discrimination, because it has, I don't know the word in English, agravante. It means that you get more years in jail when you,
yes,
an aggravant.
Yeah.
And that has worked better than the civil actions when you are discriminated, but it's not a felony, For example, when you can get into a restaurant or you are fired because of your sexual orientation, in those cases, the law definitely doesn't work. And it doesn't work because the person that has been discriminated has to pay the lawyer, has to pay for the court fees, etc. But in the criminal side, I think it has worked better, not perfectly, but better.
Yeah.
And of course, it just reacts to a discrimination, right? But it doesn't prevent it. That's one of our main critics with this law. It only works after you have been discriminated or a victim, right?
Yes.
And we think that we need an institution in Chile that can push for the social changes, for the understanding that diversity is a value and not something bad, right?
Yes, exactly. No, I understand that all. It's it is just rather surprising. It is somewhat similar here as well. I mean, there is still discrimination that goes on, but then you have to prove it. We do have something here in this province called Ontario Human Rights, and you can go through that, but you know, with government, it takes a long time. There's a lot of evidence that has to be collected and everything. So it does become complicated, and I think that happens a little, but I do think the true route on working on this is education and
Absolutely.
talking about it and showing that it is not a danger or an issue. We take a lot of our rights here in Canada for granted in the LGBTQ community, but there is always still a new fight, and people aren't always up for it. A few months ago, maybe even just 8 weeks ago, there was a big protest against, we have a new curriculum in our education system called sexual orientation and gender identity. Mm-hmm. And we had a large group of people who wanted to protest this. And I think it basically was made up of two different demographics, and I'm not casting any aspersions, but there are the protesters that are almost professional protesters, you know, that were also very much anti-vax. You know, there's a profile there. And then there are the conservative, very conservative parents, not necessarily always, like, sometimes it's a higher proportion of the Islamic, but not always. There were other people that I had talked to as well. And this is a complication. This is an approved curriculum that has been brought in. And how do you, I guess it's little steps, you know, and it gets into our school system and just bring it in, and slowly over time, I think people will become more accepting. But it's important because I think it was important also for acceptance of trans. And I'm sure it's the same debate down there. But there is a big debate. Do children, how can children even know that they're trans? Well, I have a feeling if you know, you know, right? And I know a few people who are trans that, you know, were probably better off for transitioning earlier. I also know somebody who transitioned much later as well. So those are our concerns or our fronts right now. We have marriage, we have divorce, we can adopt. I don't know. The only thing that I did bring up that I thought was interesting, I'm pretty sure we have, like, surrogacy is not a problem here, but I know surrogacy is a problem in Spain because it's an exploitation of women. Is there what's the situation of surrogacy in Chile?
The surrogacy in Chile is prohibited. Not prohibited as a human right, as a human reproduction technique, but prohibited since the Chilean law mandates that the woman that carries the baby has to be the mother of the baby. So you can't change a mother that you can't inscribe or uninscribe a woman that has carried a baby in her womb, right? So that's the reason that surrogacy doesn't exist in Chile. And it's really interesting that you asked me that, because because of a declaration of the woman ministry, Ministry of Women and Gender here in Chile. A couple of gay guys that just got married were really bullied in social network, in social media, this weekend. Because here in Chile, surrogacy, there's a lot of people against surrogacy, the conservative and also the left wing. So here in Chile is private. There is no surrogacy, but we have adoption and marriage equality.
Okay, so you do. So what is the bill that you're working on now then?
We're working in the changing, in the reform of Ley Samudio, trying to improve the action in the courts, right? And also trying to have an institution that can approve or that can push the education part in the society. That's what we're working right now. And also, of course, we are in the second constitutional constitution building process, right? That probably will be rejected again, which I'm really glad, because it's a really conservative constitution. And it's funny that you told that story about the protest against the curriculum in the education, right? Because the most popular Chilean presidential candidate nowadays for succeed president, no, for be elected after President Boric is a former representative that voted against anti-discrimination law, because he's an ultra-conservative president, like was, for example, Donald Trump or Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, right? And of course, this movement, this ultra-conservative movement that is trying to bring us back in our success, or in the protection network that we have built these 10 years, is also here in Chile.
Yeah. For people in Canada that may not know this, Chile is trying to revamp or redo their constitution, because the constitution they have is still from the dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet, right?
Right.
So it's a complicated issue on how to create something that, you know, fits everybody. And of course, everybody, you know, everybody has their certain agenda. We're lucky we have our constitution in place, and we're very mild-mannered in that aspect. So we are lucky with that. I was going to also ask about the book once again. I read that there was some criticism of the book, and I don't know what the whole story is with that. I also know there's a little mini series or something about it too.
And a movie.
And a movie. Okay,
yes.
So is the criticism because it wasn't accurate, or is it also maybe just because it seems to reason away why it happened?
I haven't read the book. That's the truth. I know Rodrigo Fluxavi because he has another books, and I really enjoy what he has written. But this book I didn't read it. But the criticism is about that. What I heard is that it tries to say that what was doing Daniel at the night, at that hour, after drinking alcohol, right? And of course, you can have all those questions, but none of them justifies what happened to him, right? I don't think that he says or that he wrote that trying to justify, but I've heard that the criticism about this book is about that it says a lot, that it gives a lot of details about the life or the lifestyle of Daniel, and I don't think that has a lot to do. But again, I haven't read it, so
Well,
I'm not sure.
I haven't read it all, but I'm up to the part where Daniel's had the relationship's going to go bad. And I think it happens shortly after that. He has a relationship with an older man, and, he's living quite comfortably and everything. But they have also gone through the life story of each of the assailants, of each of the people involved with his brutal beating. And there is, and I mean, it is probably true, there are a lot of social factors that factor into this, and drinking may factor into this too, but nothing actually in the end excuses a killing like that, I mean, if people, I mean, every time people drink, that just doesn't happen. But that's exactly the same. That's another similarity with the Kenneth Zeller story. The young boys were men. One of them was old enough to pass to get alcohol at that time. At that time, I do remember it was age 18. He was 17, and there weren't restrictions. So they had all been drinking. It was like the last day of school. It was a hot summer day. They were, for lack of a better word, and it's a word I don't think we use anymore, but they were roughhousing, they were play fighting, basically. And then at one point, they decided that let's go down to Hyde Park and beat up a queer. So there was intent. They even went out of their way to go there. And that again, it's the same. There's almost like a mob mentality here, attacking one person that has been classified as fair game, and not considered somebody worthy of any sort of respect or anything. So it is interesting how that parallels, and I think that's probably the story for a lot of that. Actually, I was surprised. I don't know how this will show up on camera. Is that read the right way?
Yes.
People, okay. Because for me, it's backwards. I came across this book. This is homophobic violence in Canada. It's kind of thick, isn't it?
Yes.
I have yet to read it. I think it was somebody's PhD dissertation. But there's a lot of stories in there. And I think, a lot of that does happen. I am going to try and share again, but this time I'm just going to share my whole screen, I think. Here, desktop. There we go. And then I will find, sorry about this, it's a little messy, a desktop. I'm going to find that PowerPoint because I wanted to bring up two more points. So this here, like I found these pictures. So this is something that's still very much in the consciousness of like the public in Chile, right?
Yes, absolutely.
People are very much, if you say the name, they will know who this is.
Absolutely. Every single person.
Yeah.
And if you show a picture, also they know who he is.
Yeah. Well, and he looks, I mean, they said that he looked incredibly young too, so that was a part of it as well. This is the book here, that I am reading. It's not a difficult read from the point of view of language. It was just a difficult read from, the actual subject matter. Here are some pictures and quotations from the Toronto story. So this is 1985. In my opinion, that's not that far back. I know it is kind of 40 years, but it's not. And these are some quotations here. The boys were in a rowdy mood. Hey, one of them said, why don't we go beat up a queer instead of fighting each other? One of the boys called you queer and then tripped him. The man started to run and the group chased him back up the trail. And then we have this one here as well. I try not to, I don't necessarily, this is a drawing, so this isn't an actual photograph, but we were talking about not using triggering images. But this is sort of the representation here. And he did manage to get to the car, but I think from what I read in the article, it was just the way they attacked him and in that car, and there are metal edges and everything. And what happened with these four young men, so it came up again, what was this, teacher librarian doing in a park at that time? These people, so what they did was actually they took a plea. How did they do this? They agreed to be tried in adult court for a lesser charge of manslaughter. And then they had a lot of experts come in, character witnesses and everything. And it was more or less portrayed that these four unfortunate young boys, who are not at all hateful or anything, just made a very bad choice and made a mistake. So they were still berated. They still, I think it was 9 years or not, but it ended up being 18 months they got out. So, and it was a very, very light sentence. So there wasn't a lot of good outcome from that. The only good outcome that came from that was then at that point, a trustee. So we have these people that are in charge of the board, and it's a group of people. So a specific trustee started to enact changes in school board policy to prevent discrimination and to protect, teachers in that situation, and also to introduce, gay-friendly curriculum. I think that was a time when we could, the province wasn't so in charge with curriculum, and schools could include that themselves much more. That trustee happens now to be our mayor in Toronto. So it was interesting. That was Trustee Olivia Chow back in 1985, and now that is Mayor Olivia Chow in 2023. So it is sort of interesting. Well, a lot of things are interesting here. Somebody did make a change and it stuck. That person is still around, and it has come up recently now because of the election or whatever. This story is mentioned, but in a very small footnote in certain magazine articles and everything. I am going to show this picture here. This, I do believe, the woman on the right is the mother, correct? Gabriella?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, so I elected not to show the actual assailants here, but I do have their names here. But I like this one quotation that the judge did say. It was extreme cruelty and total disrespect for human life. And if you read about it, you will see that. This is a quotation, though, from the Toronto Story. And this was a commentary from the writer, and it does really seem to be the case. I don't think we hear anymore. I'm sure there are still incidents of this happening, but gay bashing seems to be much more on the decline, I hope. I might be speaking out of turn. But I do think there has been a lot of education made. There has been a lot more. There's still discrimination. There's still stigma, but it's not like it was when I was a young man. Okay, so I do think there's been progress, but it's been very, very small. But this is this major point, and I think it applies as well to Daniel as well as Kenneth here. It's this whole dehumanization. They just wanted a punching bag, and to take out whatever upset or grief or anger. And I get that in a way. I've actually just started to learn how to box, but I never plan on learning how to box a person, but I'm being taught that way. But I thought, there are better ways of getting rid of your frustration. You could take boxing lessons, There is absolutely no reason whatsoever, no excuse for actually taking somebody's life for whatever reason. But in this case, I'm talking about the gay lives, LGBTQ lives. So yeah, I think I'm just going to see if I had another question here for you. We did ask that. Did I ask if the public think they feel like justice was achieved or not?
I would say that yes, yes, justice was achieved, and three of these guys are still in jail, and actually the one that got free met with Daniel's father.
Correct.
And he asked for forgiveness. I don't remember what Daniel's father told him.
I think he said no.
I think he said
him.
no also.
I did see it on YouTube, and I can't even imagine that interaction, but I did see it. And that was the younger one, right? That Mora.
Yes.
Mora. Yeah.
The younger one and the one that basically was watching. I don't remember much of the case of Daniel of what exactly was the participation of each one, right? But this was the younger and the one that got less years in jail. And he met Daniel's father, as I told you, and he asked for forgiveness. I think the father said no. Daniel's father is an amazing man. It's really an amazing man. I care about him really, really much. He's an amazing person.
Yeah, it seems like it. Like I know it was probably is still like the mother and father are not together.
Yes.
But they were very much, I mean, this sort of tragedy does kind of bring you together in a different way. And it is interesting to see, because a lot of people are abandoned by their families when they come out, but this was just, a level of, it was really ruthless what happened. And I think you would really be hard pressed to call yourself human if you didn't feel anything. So I'm just going to ask if anybody, I'm going to look here in the chat, if there are any questions, or if anybody had a question, because if not, we are going to let this man go to bed because he has to be ready for tomorrow. Is there anybody that has a question or anything of me, of Juan?
Where's chat?
I heard somebody, but I don't know who that was.
Hi, Tom. It's Patty. I'm just looking for my chat button.
Oh, yeah. No, you're here.
It like disappeared.
No, you're here. I can hear you. Did you want to start your video? You don't have to if you don't want to.
I thought it was on.
No, it's not.
Oh, for God's sakes.
Oh, okay, there. So what's your question, Patty?
Look. Huh. You want to make this? No. Did I lose you? Oh.
Yeah, we can see you. It's good. Everything's good.
Okay. Can you hear me as well?
Yeah.
Yes.
This has been fabulous. One, what a great conversation with you. And as a parent, sickens my soul. It really does. And I worked youth justice for 34 years, so very familiar with youth courts and some of the goings there. We often talk of, and I think I put it in my question about pack mentality.
Yeah.
Many times the youth I worked, I would ask, if you were alone, would this have ever happened? And majority had always said that they wouldn't have the courage to have acted alone, but so difficult at that age. When you look at, psychological development, ages, stages, to say no when you're with your peers and afraid peers might turn on you if you back out. What are your thoughts on that?
I agree. I definitely agree. I was thinking and remembering another case after Daniel that where it was not a man who was attacked, it was a woman, a lesbian woman. And she again was attacked by a pack. two men. And two men, she survived. Her name is Carolina Torres. If you want to Google her case later, Carolina Torres. I'm going to write it in the chat. And Carolina was attacked by two men also in Santiago in a district called Pudahuel, and well, she also was killed. She was also killed, almost killed. That case, we present the case to the justice in Iguales, and we represent the family. And also, those two guys are still in jail. They were sentenced, and they are both in jail until today. I will write the name if you want to also know
Yes.
about this case.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Here. Yes. Carolina Torres. This was February 2019, I think. I'm not sure, but I think it's 2019.
Thank you.
Well, and I would have to agree I mean, I have less of a complete expertise in this, but in teaching, I mean, I would see this a lot, right? I just don't think we had anything really bad happen in the schools where I was, but definitely you could see that. And I wonder why it's more of a male thing than a female thing. There's a certain kind of socialization that way. There's something going on there, right? And we know that, you know, that boys are told not to cry, boys are told not to show emotion, you have to be tougher than the other one. So that all plays into it. It is unfortunate, but I think there just has to be continual work done on that. Definitely.
Absolutely.
Are there any other questions? If not, I am going to call this an evening. I'd like to thank Juan for joining us all the way from Valparaiso. I can assure you that it is a beautiful country to go and visit. In fact, it is quite stunning, you know, and it's so different. It's a very long country from north to south. It stretches quite a bit. So I've been in the middle and I've been at the top. I haven't been to the bottom. I do know it's very much a protected ecosystem because it is isolated between the ocean and the Andes. So they're very careful with any plants that you might bring in or animals. They don't want any invasive species. The Atacama Desert is absolutely beautiful. It's very high. We were at 1.4 kilometers above sea level, and that's why I burned my scalp. I have very thin hair. And it was just, and it's very dry. It's a very dry desert as well. But there's the driest
desert in the world.
Yes, very much. But I was amazed by that little town up there. There are a lot of people that go there. And they keep it looking a certain way so that it has that kind of, I don't want to say primitive, but more rustic.
Yes, absolutely.
Very rustic, you know, so it was amazing. I do think that is just about it. I'd like to thank everybody. I'd like to thank Carolina there as well for giving me all the nudge to go ahead with this and as well the know-how to do this as well. And I appreciate that. She's my Argentinian friend, so the others.
Los hermanos argentinos, le tengo mucho cariño, tengo familia en Argentina, quiero mucho a mis hermanos argentinos.
Muchas gracias, Juan, nosotros también a ustedes, aunque estamos un poquito complicados ahora.
Así es, pero mucha fuerza, mucha fuerza.